Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session, first one of 2023. Today, of course, is the 1st of January, 2023. Happy New Year, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well, had a good holiday season, and a Happy New Year to you in terms of making great sound on all sorts of projects. Let's go ahead and jump into the agenda and talk about what we've got in the queue for today. First up, we do have our Fairlight Mixing Fundamentals course. This is something that we were able to record last week. It is actually in the can, as they say, and now we're working on post-production. We're hoping to have that all ready by February 1st. If you're interested in that course, it'll be over at school.learnlightandsound.com. And if you're not already signed up there, I would recommend you do. We will have a special for those that are already members of the school over there. Doesn't cost anything to sign up for the school. We'll be sending out a coupon for a few dollars off when that launches here in the next few weeks. So that's the first thing. Second, today we're going to talk about EQ for spoken word, dialogue, voice recordings. And then after that, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some possibilities for what the future brings as far as audio is concerned, both in terms of recording equipment, post-production, all of those types of things. I hesitate to call them predictions. I guess you can maybe call them predictions. I'm not, in any case, we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And that's what we'll do. We didn't have any questions submitted ahead of time, so we will go to the chat afterwards and see if we've got anything there. All right, so let's go ahead and start with EQ. Let's talk about equalization. So EQ is a shortened version in the audio world, we typically refer to them as EQ. It's a variety of tools. It stands for equalization, and it refers to being able to sculpt the sound that you're working on, whether it's recorded sound, live sound, whatever it is. You can actually boost it at certain frequencies or cut it at certain frequencies. And let me just kind of give you a sense for what I'm talking about here. If we go over to the Mac here, over here in the middle of the screen, I know it's going to be a little bit difficult for those on phones today to follow all of the details, but here's an equalizer. And what we have represented on the left-hand side here are the low frequencies, the bass frequencies. Of course, on the right-hand side, the higher frequencies. And what we can do at any given frequency in this particular EQ is we can choose our frequency and we can boost it or we can cut it. So what's interesting is that in audio processing, whether you're doing it in real time or in post-production, almost all the tools that we have are for actually boosting or cutting levels. And that can take a variety of different ways. I mean, if you think about a compressor is actually decreasing the level on certain signals that get through. A gate's doing a similar thing. An expander is doing a similar thing. An EQ is either allowing you to boost or cut at certain frequencies. So they're all kind of doing the same thing in different ways to affect the sound in different ways, but that's what an equalizer is. Now, the first question I think people ask, and I think it's a good question, is when would I use an EQ? When would I want to use an EQ, and what kind of problems does it solve? And I see it as kind of two main areas. I think it's, for my purposes, it's largely, initially at least, about cleaning things up and about reducing harshness. In fact, fixing other types of issues. So if there's a resonance of some sort, something just sounds really harsh or is like echoing or reverberating, and it's not reverb in general is a bigger issue, but if you've got kind of a boxy sounding room where you made your recording, you can actually go in and change that. And you can actually use an EQ to kind of find it. You might boost your levels and sweep across them like this to find and use your ears while you're listening to it to find where a certain resonance may be occurring. And then you can cut that resonance. So a lot of times, my first approach with EQ is to cut. If you're finding yourself doing a lot of boosts, then you probably need to ask yourself the question, is this really helping? Almost always cuts are going to help. And in fact, what's interesting is that a cut can actually make something sound warmer. It can make it sound richer. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily consider at first. A lot of times they'll come in and try to boost the bass. They'll just keep pumping that bass up until it sounds nice and broadcasty. the reality is a lot of times rather than doing that and making it start to sound really woolly and woofy, what can actually be a lot more helpful is cutting frequencies that are just a little too harsh, usually a little bit higher up. And that can make a bigger difference and make it sound warmer and richer overall. So that's my first approach. Now, that's not the only approach, and usually I'll do this early on in the mixing process. If I'm processing some audio in post, I will typically do these kind of corrective types of EQ changes, cuts, relatively early on. You can actually also emphasize what sounds good, and what you may want a little bit more of. We're gonna look at this in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes here, and I want to caution people again not to go crazy or wild, pushing especially low frequencies too much. A lot of people are looking for that rich broadcast sound where you get up, you sound like you're on the FM radio in 1980 or maybe in the 70s. But the problem is that if you start boosting it too much, it might sound really good at first, but if people are playing that back in their car, and I don't know, sometimes it can be really difficult to listen to if you've got other like road noise and things like that, or you're in an airplane and flying and you're wearing really good headphones, and sometimes that can just be fatiguing to listen to if you've got too much bass. So just be a little bit careful with that, and we'll give an example of that a little later on. All right, I think that was everything I wanted to cover in the slides there. So let's go ahead and switch over. Oh, actually, we were on the Mac the whole time. That's fine. I said everything that I needed to say, so I think we're good. Let me just do a demonstration here. I've got a recording. Actually, in fact, it's from our upcoming Fairlight Fundamentals mixing course. Let me just kind of run through and show you how I would use an EQ in this particular case, and how I would just use it to help make the sound a little bit nicer, a little bit easier to listen to. Maybe remove a little bit of harshness, a little bit of low frequency rumble, and just show you how that goes. And let me describe the general technique. So first of all, typically I'll apply a high pass filter. That's just going to roll off these low frequencies. And you might roll that up for men's voices somewhere in the 60 to 70 to 75 range. If it's sounding really bassy, like somebody was really up close on the microphone and you're getting a lot of proximity effect like that, you might want to run it up a little higher. And for women's voices, I find I can often run it up into the 120, 130 range and not cut into their voice, but still get rid of a lot of low frequency stuff. And that can be air conditioning. It can be just other room noise. In fact, I just realized that the fan on my camera is still on. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Okay, and of course, I always stand by the idea that it's better to deal with it before it gets to the microphone than after it gets to the microphone. So just keep that in mind. So that's typically what I do. And then what I do is, if I'm hearing some harshness, what I'll do is I'll typically take one of and this is what's called a parametric equalizer. This is one where you can actually choose your frequencies and sweep back and forth and choose exactly how much it cuts. And we're going to look at some other types of equalizers here as well. But here I can choose the overall width, or it's often referred to as Q. They're related. They're not the exact same thing, but I'll often boost this Q or reduce the width quite a lot to about 20 here. And what that does is it really helps me pinpoint what frequency is the problem, or which frequencies are the problem. So, and then I can take that and just sweep it back and forth. And I boost it almost always by 9 dB. I find if you go farther than that, everything sounds wrong. But if you go to 9 dB, you can generally really, really hear where the problems lie. And I'll very, very slowly sweep it until I find something that sounds rather harsh or resonant in some way, and I can reduce it from there. And we may do a couple of those, so let's go ahead and start here. I'm going to go ahead and what I can do is I can turn this one off for now. So I'm going to start playing back, and I'm going to do some experimenting and listen very carefully. If you're on your phone, listening on phone speakers, you may have a hard time. Best if you can use your best headphones here as we're doing this kind of really careful work here, trying to find the troublesome frequencies. So here we go. Manually choose something as if you are having problems playing back. You have maybe lots of tracks you're working with, and you're getting some sort of clicking and popping that is inexplicable, or perhaps UI is complaining to you that it doesn't have enough resources to play things back, you might want to use a longer buffer time. The problem with using a longer buffer is that it will increase the latency. You notice here if I increase that to 2048, the latency is now 42 milliseconds. That's substantial. Things will no longer be in sync if you do that. So it's normally you want to be something smaller than that, but if you set it to auto, Resolve will manage all of that for you. So that's generally where you're going to want to be. Record buffer size. If you are having problems with recordings and you're getting clicks and pops and inexplicable excuse me. Record buffer size. Record buffer size. If you're getting inexplicable pops and clicks and things like that, a couple things you can check, but this is one of them. Record buffer size, you can actually increase that to some extent. Most audio interfaces that are modern are not going to have any sort of problems with that, so generally not something you have to worry about. Input device. This is where you're going to get your microphones. No, by default, they are set to system settings. What that means is whatever you have configured in your operating system will be applied here as well. And that's generally what I leave it at. So for example, in this particular case, I am recording with a Universal Audio Volt 276, and it is using that as our input and as our output device as well, because that's what I have configured in the operating system. If on the other hand, you want to choose a specific thing, so for example, I know I want to get my microphone from the Volt, I can select the Volt here. Or if I know I'm going to play back the audio via my Volt, either to headphones or to speakers, monitors that I have connected to it, I would choose that here if I, for whatever reason, I always... Okay, so there's an example there. I found a couple of frequencies there that are a little bit, were a little bit harsh, and this is pretty typical for my voice. But if you're in the wrong kind of room, sometimes down here in the 300 hertz range, you can find stuff that's a little bit funky. But in my case, I've got a lot of energy here at about 1,000 hertz and quite a bit at 2 kilohertz as well. And so again, it's literally just using your ears to decide, ooh, this does sound a little bit harsh, and doing fairly mild cuts here. The problem is what you don't want to do is, let me just do an example of this. I'm going to do massive, massive cuts here so you can hear what it sounds like. Always wanted to use that within DaVinci Resolve. Typically, I would just go ahead and leave them at the Use System Settings. Next up is Automatic Speaker Configuration. Now, again, with this checked, it will just use whatever the system has set up for speakers, and that's generally what I leave it at. But if you do want to change that, if you do have a customized setup, you can do that, and that changes it so that you have all sorts of additional settings down here. Now, you can choose a variety of different... Okay, see, the thing with voice is that a lot of the articulation and clarity is going to be here in these mids, I would say 1 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, even up to 3 kilohertz, and maybe even up to 4. You're going to get the more sibilant type things, and some of the consonants are going to run a little higher here as well. Sibilants typically start somewhere around 4,500 hertz or a little bit higher and up to about 10 kilohertz. So that's going to be in this range over here. But just pulling a little bit of that out took the harshness off, but still left it articulate enough that it could be understood. So that's one example here of equalization. Why don't we pause there and take a look and see if we have any questions or thoughts or input out there in the chat. Motogo Yo, great going, calmly delivering extraordinarily valuable information over the years. Thank you and happy 2023. Thank you so much, Moto. Happy New Year to you, and thanks for the super chat as well. Shoji, Happy New Year. In what order do you apply voiceover effects? Compression, EQ, level, etc. Great question. I'm glad you brought that up, Shoji. When I'm doing corrective EQ, I typically do that before compression. Yeah, so of those that you've listed there, I'll typically do this before compression. We'll also talk about something called push-pull or pull-push equalization that is often used. Some other pretty famous engineers use a technique like that, where you actually decrease the bass, you pull the bass frequencies down, then you do your compression, and then you push the bass frequencies back up, interestingly. So that's one way you can do it, and we'll demonstrate what that does here in a minute. So typically I'm going to do my corrective EQ, then compression. I may do another pass of EQ for sweetening, and then I'll generally boost the overall levels from there. So that's generally how I approach it. Good question. And there are 1,000 ways. There's not one simple answer. So definitely experiment. Don't ever stop experimenting. Okay, from Jake. I mix more live singing vocals, but my vocal EQ took a leap forward after studying a frequency response chart of a mic I really like the sound of, the Neumann KMS 105, particularly on the top end. Very good. Yeah, and mixing vocals are kind of a different thing too, because in mixing vocals, you are putting the vocals into a mix. And with the mix, there's a lot of other instruments going at the same time. Therefore, if you were to solo a song vocal without listening to any of the rest of the song, it can actually kind of sound a little bit weird. And a really good effective EQ for a mix on a vocal may make that standalone vocal not sound that great. So that's an important thing to keep in mind too. And I think when you're approaching music for vocals, sometimes you may want a little bit more top end, high frequencies, if you will, to make it stand out in the mix a little bit better and to sparkle some. Where it may end up turning kind of grating for spoken word. Homesick Mac, my voice is rather airy without a lot of substance. I always sound hoarse. What EQ cutoff would you recommend in my case? That's, again, I would use the exact same technique I used here and find the frequencies. I can't tell you right off the top of my head. I'd have to hear things and ideally put it through an EQ and find it myself. But and if you want to send one over, maybe that could be a demonstration we could do. But yeah, use this technique. Put boost by 9 dB, narrow the Q quite a bit, and very slowly sweep and find where if you're finding any sort of weird resonances, that's where you can do a cut. And sometimes you don't need a cut. Sometimes you do need a boost. But if you're talking about rather airy, there may be a cut somewhere in the higher frequencies that you need to do that could help. Okay, Danny says 2 more. Mark, how many?
2 parts.
2-part question. How many bands will you normally work with when doing EQ? Totally depends. Append to previous, specifically when doing the sweeps. Well, I just sweep one at a time. So you'll notice one thing I did do here is that if we go back to the Mac here really quick, or sorry, Danny, this is, there we are. I did actually move this high pass filter up to 76 hertz. So it was sounding a little bit boomy, a little bit too much on the low end. There was a lot of proximity effect on that mic in the way I was using it. So I actually moved it up to 76 and it started rolling off a little bit of that, just a little bit because there was too much going on. And then I came back and did one sweep at a time. So just 1 point at a time. And then, you don't have to use, there's no rule in terms of how many you can use or can't use. Most EQs are going to have, in this case, for example, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just full, kind of the bell curve style of parameters. And then we also have a high frequency boost and a low. Actually, this is a low. So it's actually 5, I guess. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this one here is a little bit unique. Let me turn off my high pass filter and show you this one here. This one is actually a shelf, so I can actually boost an entire shelf or drop the shelf. So different ways you can approach that there. We're going to turn that off. And you can also do that on the high frequencies as well. You can see we can just boost everything. Obviously, if you go really wild, it's going to really make things go crazy. But that is, those are some options you have there usually. So to answer your question, Mark, I would stick with one at a time. And also what I would do is when you're playing it back, most EQ plugins will have a thing where you can power it off or bypass it. And you'll want to do that. Kind of listen, do your sweep, find a frequency, cut it some, and then bypass it or disable it for a period of time to get your ears set back to the original sound, and then turn it on and just make sure that sounds better to you. That's the secret. That's the approach that I typically take. Okay. Showed you another question. What EQ adjustments do you do to just about all of your VO adjustments: high pass, low pass, other. So almost always a high pass filter. Again, somewhere in this, we're talking like spoken word audio. Somewhere in the, again, I kind of ran through some of those earlier, but for men, usually starting about 60 hertz-ish, maybe up to 70 some hertz. Unless there's a low frequency problem, I might push a little bit farther up the spectrum. For women's voices, I'll often push up a little bit higher, more like in the 120 range. Low pass filter, which is or a high cut filter, depends on what's going on. If there's some funny stuff going on up there, I will apply that, but I don't always apply that necessarily. In music, you'll typically want to do that because you'll get, when you're putting, 15 tracks of instruments together, you have to be really, really careful about things stacking up and getting really, really congested at certain frequencies. So that's kind of a different thing. But if you're just doing spoken word where one person's talking at a time, I don't necessarily believe you always have to do a high cut or a low pass filter. So, but in mine, I'll almost always do a cut or two depending on the voice and the microphone fit of the person that was recording into that. Some people just sound great. They don't need any corrective EQ other than a high pass filter, which again is not them. It's just, the ambiance that you're kind of managing there. So that's my general philosophy and approach on that. Jake, do you ever use any saturation plugins for spoken word, or are you going for more of a clean and natural sound? Not so well. I mean, we're not exactly doing a clean and natural sound here today. We're using a Shelford channel, which has some transformers on the input and on the output, I believe, as well. So not intentionally. I don't typically use saturation plugins for spoken word. Some people have different feelings on that, but no, typically not. But we will talk about the push-pull EQ if you want to get more of a broadcast sound to it. But yeah, you could do that. I learned so much for your videos, especially about audio. Thank you for all your great content. Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate it. Thanks for also being part of the community here. Thanks for being a point of inspiration. It's January 1st here, and here you are. And here you are as well, Vishal. Thanks so much for joining. And Camille, thanks. Thank you for a year of interesting educational information. Happy 2023 to the three of you and to the sound community. Thanks so much, Camille, for the super chat, and thanks for being a part of it and bringing your positivity to it as well. Yeah, what are your good intentions for 2023? Any interesting projects in the pipeline? Yes, we have. We want to do more courses. Finding the time has always been the challenge, but I'm very excited about the new Fairlight Mixing Fundamentals course. So that's probably the biggest thing we have coming early this year. We are going to talk about some of our audio predictions or musings for later this year, and that's coming up in just a few minutes here. But yeah, we have lots of... I think that the future of audio is looking quite positive. There's some things that are concerning as well. I think that, in fact, we were just watching a show over the break here where I felt like we had to turn on the closed captions to be able to understand it, to really understand everything that was being said and really get all of the messaging there, the nuance. We'll talk more about that later, but there are some concerning things, but I think there's also an opportunity for all of us as soundies to do better and to make a better experience for our audiences. So lots of good stuff. Okay. Anything else in the chat, or should we go back to more EQ? Oh, more coming. Happy New Year. Hey, Miguel. It's great to see you. And Happy New Year to you and your family as well. Lots of nice stuff. Okay, great. All right, we're going to hop back over to the Mac here. I want to go to a different audio sample and show you something else here. Let's come over into RX, and let me just play you this bit here and kind of show you how I would approach this as well. All right, take two on our practical noise floor sample. So we're recording out in our studio area, and I have the gain set to 62 dB of gain, and I'm about 2-3 inches from the front of the microphone. And so I'm going to go ahead and be quiet for just a couple of moments here, and we're going to capture our noise floor sample. Okay, so that's where we're starting. Let me just do a few things here. There are a few things that are driving me crazy in this. Not crazy, but annoying me. Number one, listen to this. Okay, there's some mouth noise. That is not good. So we're in RX at this point. So I'm going to come over here to our mouth declick. And I don't think we need to go quite that wide. Let's go back to our default. And let's preview that. All right, take 2. Yeah, that's better. Render. You'll notice those little clicks went away. We may have some more of that. I bet you right here. Playing it. Yeah. So preview. Capture our... good. That gets rid of a good bit of that. Okay. Breaths. Breaths are a huge topic that we can talk about. And I apologize. We're taking a little bit of a detour. I promise you we will get back to EQ. But just wanted to cover a couple of things here and just this little vocal sample and how I would approach it. So I would take breaths and I keep them. I don't get rid of breaths. But what I do want to do is I do want to manage them. I don't want them to be quite so prominent. So I will typically bring up our little gain module here and we'll drop it maybe 9 dB. So let me just undo that and play it before. Okay, and then process it and after. Still there, not quite as prominent, not as annoying. And we can do that for all of our breaths here. Now, you might ask, why don't you just use breath control? We have breath control right up here. And in fact, in the past, I have used breath control quite a bit, but I find it misses a lot. And in fact, if you set it mild enough so that it doesn't overdo it, then it misses a bunch of breaths. And if you set it aggressively enough that it does get the breaths, then sometimes it's cutting out other stuff too. It can be really tricky depending on the voice you're working with. Sometimes it works. A lot of voices, it will just be too aggressive. So that is why I don't necessarily pull that out. And again, it just depends. If you're doing a YouTube video and quick turnaround, audience isn't really picky, then you don't have to do this stuff. I'm just showing you the options there for really kind of getting into your audio and making a great experience for your audience. So there's another breath there. And I think that's going to do it for us. So we'll zoom back out. Okay. I'll do another listen through here. Just make sure I didn't miss any. There sometimes can be mouth noise in the midst of a word. Let's see if we've got any of that. All right, take 2 on our practical noise floor sample. So we're recording out in our studio area, and I have the gain set to 60. Might have heard something there. Studio area, and I have something definitely right in here. Our studio area, and I have... Yep. Okay. That took care of that. Whoops. Studio area, and I have the gain set to 62 dB of gain, and I'm about 3 inches from the front of the microphone. And so I'm going to go ahead and be quiet for just a couple of moments here, and we're going to capture our... we have this little... In the breath here, we have this sort of... or something, so we're going to declick that as well. That's going to be the standard declick. Okay, after our noise floor sample. Okay, another little click right here. That could be mouth declick. Nope, undo. Let's get our standard declick up here. You can see they're actually different tools. That took care of it.
How can you tell?
1 second. What was that?
How can you tell?
Oh, well, so question was, how do you tell? How do you tell which of those to use? Another big discussion, but we actually do have a video where we talk specifically about those two. The declick tends to do really well with very distinct clicks, whereas the mouth declick does better with kind of moisture noises, is my overall impression. So it's a great question. Thanks, Danny. Our noise floor sample. Okay, so that's what we're starting with. So I would do that, and then I'm going to go ahead and save that. All right, so that's our cleaned up version. Let's come over into Ozone. I want to show you something interesting. Now, this is one that we haven't used Ozone on on the stream here before. I'm not going to save those changes. This file, we're going to open or import an audio file. I am going to go get the practical noise floor sample. This is the one we just cleaned up in RX. And we're going to turn off the equalizer and the maximizer. And we've already listened to this, so we're good there. But what I want to do, let's go get a preset that has a sort of a vintage style EQ. I want to show you that as well. I've got seemingly a million different presets here, but we're going to look for one called, I think it's soft vocals is what we're looking for. And I think it's in a different, is it in here? Soft vocals, there we go. Okay, so here is an equalizer. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the dynamics and the compressor here. But here's an equalizer. And again, this will be hard for those on the phone, but if you want to really kind of dig into the details, take a look on your computer at some point. This EQ is kind of weird. If you're used to looking at typical equalizers, like more traditional modern parametric equalizers. So here, for example, you have, okay, you can choose your low frequency and you can do a boost or a cut at that frequency. Okay, that's the first thing that's kind of unusual. And this is modeled after several kind of classic passive tube equalizers, specifically the Pultec, which is a very popular series of vintage. I think they were made initially in the 1960s. But that's one thing. So you have a boost or a cut at the same frequency. You also have this low mid boost. You have your mid where you can apply a cut, again, kind of covering that same frequency range and going a little bit higher even. You have your high boost, and in the case of the high boost, you can choose how wide, or you can choose its Q, which, and again, think of that roughly the same as width. You have a high cut, and you have a high mid boost. So you might be thinking, what's going on here? And you might also notice here that the default setting on this is here. They have a low mid boost at 200 hertz, and they applied 7 dB. That's a lot for vocals or for spoken word. And then a mid cut at 300 hertz, just a little bit higher than that, a cut of the same amount, roughly. And so the question is, why would you do that? Why do that? Let me just play this back for you so you can hear. And again, these are extreme settings, so not necessarily something you would typically do, but just so you can hear it, I'm going to turn it off and play first. All right, take 2 on our practical noise floor sample. So we're recording out in our studio area, and I have the gain set to 62 dB of gain, and I'm about 2-3 inches from the front of the microphone. And so I'm going to go ahead and be quiet for just a couple of moments here, and we're going to capture our noise floor sample. Okay, could you hear that? I'm curious could you hear that, Danny?
I didn't realize you turned it.
Okay, so I turned it on and off. Let me do that again. I'm gonna start with it off, and then I'm going to turn it on. It'll take it a second or two to kind of kick in, and you'll start to hear it after a second or two. And then I'll turn it back off again. So listen carefully here. All right, take 2 on our practical noise floor sample. So we're recording out in our studio area, and I have the gain set to 62 dB of gain, and I'm about 2-3 inches from the front of the microphone. And so I'm going to go ahead and be quiet for just a couple of moments here, and we're going to capture our noise floor sample. Okay, so there's some differences there. Now, is that the perfect for my voice? No, not necessarily, but this is an example of kind of a very rough example. There's some more sophisticated ways to do this as well. This is a very rough example of kind of what some people refer to as a push-pull EQ cut boost. So in essence, you're pushing it up at 200 hertz and then pulling it down by about the same amount at 300 hertz, just barely above it. And that kind of sculpts the sound in interesting ways. And that gives you kind of a broadcasty sound. In this case, to me, it sounded like it was too much. But if you were finding that your voice, if you're working with a voice that sounds a little bit thin and not as warm as you would like it, this is a technique that you could potentially use for those circumstances. So I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that. Now, the more sophisticated approach would be to line up in a signal chain an EQ cut on the low frequencies, maybe somewhere around 200 hertz, compress, and then boost the same frequencies or very similar frequencies back up by a similar amount. And that's a technique I know Andrew Sheps has talked about that. Andrew Sheps, if you're not familiar with him, is a producer, mixer for popular music, and has worked with a lot of really popular bands or acts that you've heard of, most likely. So in any case, that's kind of the push-pull technique. So why don't we pause there and go out to the chat and see what we've got going in the chat there.
It says 3 parts.
3-part question. I volunteered to shoot and edit Christmas show. It was a mess, but the sound guys provided me with multi-tracks, 30 tracks plus main mix. The sound is really messed up, but I believe given time, I can mix and get a good mix. My question is, how do you do it? I'm using DaVinci Resolve 18 and I'm continuing to edit the video using a mixed version just to make sure I have the final video while I wait to start to edit the sound. So my question is, what would be your approach, using only Fairlight or other software? So it's a combination of video and you have all the tracks from the sound mixers. So one of the things that's interesting that you have to keep in mind is that live sound reproduction and video post-production are 2 different things. And a mix that will sound good in live sound reproduction may sound absolutely awful in post. And the reason for that is that the live sound mixer or front of house mixer, depending on the situation, what they're called, they have to tune the mix for the room where the performance is taking place. And that can require some pretty substantial EQ cuts and boosts, mostly cuts, especially to manage feedback. So the mix that you probably recorded directly from the show, from the soundboard itself, probably is not the mix you would want to use in post for your video. So that's very specific to the room. So that's why, just to give you the background, Jonathan, on why, that's the why. Then if you have isolated recordings of each of the instruments, that's where you're in a better spot where you can do a better mix. So my approach would generally be to use those isolated channels and do your own mix based on your playback system in your mix room. So that's how I would generally approach it. And I would do high, or do low cut on almost all the instruments. With music, it's a different job too than we're talking about here today. Again, as I mentioned before, you have to essentially use EQ to carve out spaces for each of the instruments. So if you have an instrument that's a very mid-range focused instrument, you're probably going to roll off a lot of the lows and a lot of the highs, or maybe just the lows, depending. If it's a bass, you're probably going to want to, and you have a kick drum as well, then you're going to have to find a way to share the spectrum between those 2 so they can both be heard. And a lot of times what you'll hear is, depending on the song or the music, they may take a kick drum and emphasize the tap of the hammer against the drum head. And it'll actually sound a little bit higher frequency than you're typically used to hearing with a kick drum, but at least it's not then lost in the mix and you still get the benefit of the rhythm there. And then that makes space for the bass guitar below that if there's a lot of low end going on with the bass guitar. So that's a big thing with music, is carving out spaces for each of the instruments. And they may actually sound a little bit odd when you do these kind of extreme EQs on each of the instruments if you play them by themselves. But when you bring them all together in a mix, then they start to kind of really come together and sound really, really nice. So that's one of the biggest things, is doing a lot of pretty heavy cuts to make sure that one instrument is not drowning out another instrument. And that's the thing I think new mixers, including myself, first, when I did my first music mixes, and I'm not on very many of them, but when I have, it's been like, oh, I can't hear the fiddle. Let's push that up a little bit. So I just move the fader up. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. Now I can't hear the guitar very well. So push that. I mean, you just get into this like music arms race where you just keep pushing things up, and that doesn't really fix the problem. What you really need to do is do some pretty extreme EQ and start making space for each of the instruments so that they can be heard. So that's the general idea. Okay. Tim, Aloha, I edit in Final Cut Pro 10. Do you recommend exporting audio for processing to another app? I almost always do my processing. If it's a pretty straightforward one, I could, in some cases, just do the processing before I even go into Final Cut Pro 10 in Isotope RX audio editor. But if I have to do a more sophisticated mix, I'll either go into Fairlight in DaVinci Resolve or I'll use Adobe Audition. And I'm learning Pro Tools as well, so there's another possibility there. But an easier round trip from Final Cut Pro 10 may be Apple's Logic. So that may be an option there if you really want to get into really deep into the audio processing. But if you've got a pretty simple, like if you're doing a talking head YouTube video, from my point of view, and it's just a single person, I would do the processing before you do your edit. Assuming you did it in one long take, that's probably the most efficient way. And then come into Final Cut Pro, sync the processed audio to the video clip, and then just do your edit. And you're in much better. That's how we do our YouTube videos, for example. So hopefully that helps, Tim. Anthony, question: Streamer one live. I live half block from major road in old house with paper thin walls. Mic picks up truck rumble. I've used the SM7B. Have Rode 180 degrees to mic, noise gate, EQ, bass on Go XLR, etc. What else can I do? Whew. I don't know a lot about soundproofing, but it sounds like you're probably going to need some soundproofing. So you'll notice here, for example, these traps here, these are bass traps. These are not for soundproofing. These are for acoustic treatment. And by the way, those are two separate, distinct things with different goals. You'll use some of the same materials, but it's not the same. So these, for example, are used to take the sound that's played out of the speakers and absorb them so that they don't continue to bounce around the room. You can also, they're also diffusers that will take the sound and kind of diffuse them, which is another thing that happens with acoustic treatment. But soundproofing is a different matter. What you're trying to do is keep sound from transferring out from the outside into your room. And that's a bigger job. And I think that's typically going to require some, you can use sound blankets to help a tiny bit, but they're not going to get a lot of that low frequency. And if you get a lot of truck rumble, your biggest challenge is the low frequencies. So I think you'll probably want to talk. I'm not an expert in soundproofing, so you'll probably want to talk to somebody that knows a little bit more about that. I know they do use rock wool in a lot of insulation situations where you're trying to manage, to do some sound isolation. So rock wool may be one thing. You don't want to just stick a bunch of rock wool in your room though, because you don't want to breathe the dust of that. So be really careful with that. So I would talk to somebody who knows more about soundproofing. Okay, Thomas, thanks for doing this. I've been using a small diaphragm condenser for dialogue, but I'm trying out lavaliers and boosting 3000 hertz in my EQ. What recommendations do you make for lav mics? Lav mics, again, I would use the process where you find the frequencies that aren't working well and work on the cuts. Depending on where you place the mic, it can sound drastically different on the same person. If you go center of chest, you're probably going to get more chest resonance. You're going to get a more boomy sound where you may need to do some low frequency cuts. If you move it off to the side, you're going to get a little bit less of the chest resonance and a lot more of the high frequency from their mouth because you're moving the microphone out from the sound shadow underneath someone's chin. And so you're going to pick up some of those higher frequencies. Remember, higher frequencies are much more directional. Lower frequencies are more omnidirectional. So ideally for lavalier microphones, you almost always want to place them off to the side if you can to pick up a little bit more of the high frequency. It also depends on how the lavalier is voiced, but I would use the sweep technique we just showed and find if there are any resonances that you need to cut. A lot of times I find on my voice it starts to sound a little too boomy or nasally even. I do have a kind of a nasal element to my voice, but it's going to differ every single situation. So that's why I would my approach generally is teach people how to do that technique and then start using that technique to find what's going to work best. There's no great way to say, go to this frequency and cut by 3 dB and apply it universally. It just doesn't work that way. So hopefully that helps, Thomas. Greg, Shure SM7B has a pretty significant drop in response around 6,600 hertz. Do you try to correct that in EQ? No, not usually. In my case, with the sibilance in my, at least in my voice, no. That would just be adding back to the problem that it's already that it's solving in my particular case. But I would tune it to the person that's talking into it, and just use your ears and using the EQ sweep. If you're doing live sound, at least in post, if you're doing it, you can also do the same thing and figure out if you need to boost that back up. Yeah. So every microphone's going to have some little weird thing like that. These headphones, no, it's not these. So these are the Beyerdynamic DT 700 Pro X. The DT 900 Pro X has a massive drop at 6 kilohertz, 6,000 hertz. Inexplicably. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's not inexplicable. It's only inexplicable to me. I don't know much about the headphone design, but sometimes, yeah, you do have to make corrections. So I wouldn't by default do that, Greg. I would tune it to the voice that's coming through it. If you have time, could you please explain again when a push-pull, pull-push technique is used for a voice recording? Usually, Shoji, that's if you want, well, at least in this case here, this is kind of the bass trick that's been used in lots and lots of music vocals, where they're trying to make the voice sound richer, a lot more low end to it, but without it becoming boomy. The problem is, in fact, let's do that. Let's go back over to the Mac here really quickly. Let me demonstrate something here. Let's not do the cut, and let me play this for you. All right, take 2 on our practical noise floor sample. So we're recording out in our studio area, and I have the gain set to 62 dB of gain, and I'm about... All right, take 2 on our practical noise floor sample. So we're recording out in our studio area, and I have the gain set to 62 dB of gain, and I'm about 2-3 inches from the front of the microphone. And so I'm going to go ahead and be quiet for just a couple of moments here, and we'll go ahead and we're going to cap. Okay, so the idea here is, again, to kind of give that broadcasty sound to it, a richer sound to the voice, more bass without making it overwhelming. That's when the push-pull on the bass frequencies in particular becomes useful. So you do start to perceptually hear more bass, but you're not pushing so much bass through the system and out of the speakers that it gets just really woo, 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 to a point where you can't really understand what they're saying. So that's the main idea with push-pull. All right, follow up on Jonathan's questions. What order do you use for video editing? First sync the raw audio to the video, then video edit, and finally sound editing, or another order? Totally depends on the piece. If I'm working on a short film, it's almost always going to be sync, edit, and then mix. If I'm doing a YouTube video where it's basically just me talking, I'm actually going to process all, and I did the whole video basically in one take. I'm going to process the audio, then bring it into the edit, sync, edit the video, just put crossfades on, and call it good. So it depends on what you're working on. So that's the general approach that I take. What the reason for doing the mix afterwards on bigger pieces or pieces where you have a lot more clips that you're working with, like narrative film, is that if you've got 5 takes of every single take throughout the film that you're working on, you're going to have someone process possibly hundreds of hours worth of audio initially. And they're not, so that's kind of just a waste of time. That's why you typically do the mix after in those circumstances. If, on the other hand, it's a YouTube video, I sit down, I talk in front of the camera for 15 minutes. I might make some mistakes, and that's fine. They're going to cut those out in the edit, but it's all one audio clip. I'd rather just process all of that than take it into the edit and clean things up. So, or edit the video from there and just add crossfades and things like that. So that's how I generally approach it. But there are other valid approaches too. That's just how I do it. What headphones and speakers do you use when making EQ compression adjustments for voice? Well, we just showed here. There are a variety of them. I have the Beyerdynamic DT 700 Pro X. Those are the closed backs. I actually mostly use these on the live stream. I usually use the 900 Pro X's when I'm doing post work. For me, they sound more open. It's not quite so. These tend to get a little boomy. They're a little bass heavy but I use the closed back on the live stream so that not as much audio bleeds back out into the microphone when I'm playing it back. But I use the open backs when I'm doing post work. And I do also have others that are ridiculously expensive that probably are overkill for this type of work. But Danny uses the DT700, which are the original Biodynamic DT700s, the 80 ohm edition. They also have a 250 ohm edition, I believe. If you've got a kind of a beefier headphone amp that you can push that kind of impedance with. Got also a couple of Sennheiser more audiophile reference headphones. Don't use those as much for posts. Those are more for enjoyment and listening when I'm trying to enjoy something. You could use them. I got the HD 800S, I think it is. It's a newer version of the 800s, and also the 820s, which are the closed back edition. So those are much more expensive, but the Biodynamic is what I'm used to. I have used Sony MDR 7506s some. I prefer those mostly for production sound, not so much for post. Do you ever use an F6, which is a Waves plugin, I assume, or other dynamic EQ on spoken word? I have not used F6. I have played with the Pultec. I've got a Universal Audio Apollo, and so there's a Pultec plugin. So it kind of does some of this fun stuff here, the push-pull kind of stuff that we're talking about with vintage EQ. So that's usually the one that I go to. It's funny that most people are either in the Waves world or in the Apollo world, it seems like, in the music space. So I happen to be in the Apollo world. Nothing wrong with Waves. Waves makes some great stuff. In fact, they just updated Clarity VX, the what they call artificial intelligence noise separation. All right, what do you think were the highs and lows of sound and light area in 2022? Well, let's actually talk about that. I want to transition over to some of my audio musings for 2023 and beyond, and what I think are going to be some of the trends we're going to see. And I think the biggest thing from my point of view, oh, wait, is there another question?
Well, this was about 2022, and then could you go into
2022? Well, I think what I'm going to talk about actually covers that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into that. So a few things. Number one, I think you're going to see a lot more computational audio types of things. So computer processing of audio in various ways. And let me explain kind of what some of those things are. I think in post-production, we're seeing a lot of machine learning. They're talking a lot about artificial intelligence, but I think, frankly, in most of those cases, they're using that as a marketing term. I think it's not technically artificial intelligence. I think it's more machine learning or neural networks or things like that, using more sophisticated algorithms, not technically artificial intelligence. But I think we're going to see, we saw plenty of that in 2022. Adobe, I believe, has a project, and I can't remember the name of the project they're working on, where you can basically record into the cheapest little smartphone microphone outside in the wind. Well, maybe not in the wind, but outside. And then you can send that audio file over to their online service. And it's still I applied for the beta, but they haven't contacted me yet. And it will take that and make it actually sound like it was recorded in a studio. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, these sort of audio or auto-studioize your audio by uploading it to a service. We already see some of that, but I think you're going to see more and more of that. That's going to become more mainstream. So I do think there's still very much a place for audio engineers to understand what is happening and understand how to use an EQ, how to use a compressor, how to use all these other tools, because those auto tools are not always going to work. They're not always going to produce the best results. What they're going to do is they're going to make it really easy for people that don't know the first thing about audio to get some results that are better than where they started. And I think that's legitimate. I don't think there's a problem with that, and I don't think it's going to take away the job of audio. I mean, if you, on a set for TV or film or any sort of video production, you still need somebody that knows how to set up a microphone, to configure a mixer, so on and so forth, to start with good quality audio. There's nothing that software is going to do to completely automate that process in the short term, from my perspective. So that's one thing I think you're going to see more of. I think what's enabling a lot of this is the advances in hardware, computer hardware processing in particular. So for example, let's go ahead and switch on over to the Mac here. Apple made the transition to Apple Silicon. That actually started in 2020, but we're seeing that pretty much almost in full swing now. The only thing they haven't replaced yet in their Mac lineup is the Mac Pro. But that'll probably be coming in this year, 2023. But we're seeing enormous amounts of processing power in these new chips, including specialized processors for graphics, for neural processing, and of course the main CPU cores themselves. So I think these types of things are enabling, not just the Apple Silicon, but these types of advances in hardware processing are enabling a lot more computational things. And I think you're probably going to start to see a transition on the PC side as well. I can't imagine that the PC is going to continue to work with the decades-old Intel architecture, or the PC, the general PC architecture. I think they're going to have to probably make a move, and I would expect to see that here pretty soon if we haven't already started. I mean, you can already get some of that today, and I think it's going to become more mainstream. Computational, I was, again, talking about this. You have Cedar SDNX over here for the sound devices, mixers and recorders. We've got Noise Assist even for the Mix Pre series. So you're getting this real-time processing. You've got Mix Assist to make things easier. So again, a lot more computational type things. Of course, you have the traditional Cedar DNS, which was essentially a little box that was doing real-time processing. And that's going to continue here. Here's an interesting one by the same company that does Cedar. They started a new company. This is actually applied specifically for hearing aids, but it's a really interesting thing. The name of the company is Audiotelligence. And what they do is they make a device that you can essentially, kind of a use case is, as you get older and you start to lose some of your frequency range, the hearing capabilities at the full range of human hearing, going to a noisy restaurant, for example, becomes really taxing. It's really hard to hear what other people are saying. And they've put together software and also a hardware where you can actually place this thing on a desk. Let me see if they have a picture of it here. There's a video here you can play where you click here. Hear the difference. I'm not going to play it here so that we don't get any sort of copyright infringement issues here, but you essentially set this thing on the table and you can put it in different modes to help you hear the other people around you better through their hearing aids. And I think you can start to see that type of thing even for capturing audio for other circumstances. So what is happening there is those devices have multiple microphones, and then their software can take that and help you figure out how to isolate the voices and the sound you do want and not pick up the sound you don't want. So I think we're going to start to see some pretty substantial advances in that particular area as well. All right, let's come back out to our main camera here. I think on the post-processing side, for example, things with Isotope RX and there are lots of other Waves has their Clarity VX and lots of other tools out there. But I think what you're going to see is as the hardware gets faster and faster for what most of us use or able to afford and purchase and use for our work, you're going to start to see different approaches to denoising as well. Not just what I just talked about here with Audiotelligence, but also I think that what can happen in some cases is that an algorithm could plausibly, in the not too distant future, take a recording of voice with lots of noise maybe in the background, and be able to essentially say, okay, I've gotten an imprint of this person's voice. I can take what they're saying and essentially resynthesize it on a new track altogether. So without all of the noise. That's one potential thing that I see as a possibility. And we're just about at time here, I realize. But I think you're also seeing that in voice synthesis as well. How many times have you been to watch a YouTube video and you've got that Speechelo ad in front of the video? And it's Joey, the artificial intelligence voice. To me, those are still not quite there. They make them sound pretty good, but there's so much nuance to voice that To me, that kind of still annoys me, to be honest. But what I think you will start to see at some point is potentially some ADR situations. There are actually already companies out there doing this where you can essentially train an AI. Again, AI, I don't know if it's really AI, it's more machine learning if I had to guess, on your voice to be able to resynthesize. Maybe there was a single line that you needed to have re-recorded really quickly or reproduced really quickly. And then rather than go back into production to do it, you could have it learn your voice and replace that. I think there are pretty big ethical issues with this personally. So I have some concerns about that. If you can take a recording of somebody's voice, set your machine learning algorithm to learn it, and then start making recordings of them saying things that they never said, I think there are a lot of serious challenges with that. But these are some of the things, I think, general themes you're going to start to see in 2023 in more and more commonly, for better or for worse. I think there are a lot of these tools would be really helpful for all of us if they're used in the right ways, but there are definitely some ethical considerations that come along with them. Okay, we've got one more, Danny says here. Do you prefer destructive editors like Audition or Isotope, or inline editors like Pro Tools or Fairlight? It depends on the situation. Yeah, it depends on the situation. And the workflow also defines whether something is destructive or not. So if you're over an Audition in the multi-track mode, you're essentially non-destructive there. Isotope, a lot of the round trip processes are also non-destructive from the standpoint that when you save something, you're saving a new file, so you're not overwriting the original. I think it really just depends on the situation and what you're doing, but there's a place for both. Okay, I think that's everything for today. We're at time. Any other items in the chat that we need to bring up? Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Happy New Year to you. Hope you have a great year. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, get out there and make some great sound, and we'll talk to you really soon. Take care.